The last time we covered bad abilities on the channel, you guys crushed it, and I figured instead of just covering some useless abilities today, I wanted to shine a light on some of the worst abilities of all time in Pokemon. As of Generation 9, there are a total of 8 abilities that are so bad and competitive, I'd consider it a death sentence to even use these abilities on any Pokemon, no matter how good the Pokemon conceptually is outside of its ability. While not all of these abilities being buffed would suddenly make them see playing competitive, at the very least, they could lead to future entries in the franchise actually using these abilities with some success. So today, I want to try and buff these abilities so they're no longer a burden to future Pokemon. If you guys want to see me cover more terrible abilities like this in the future, of course, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe for more, as I cover a ton of content just like this that really angles towards the double scene. If we hit 300 likes in this video, I can easily make a part 3, where we buff some even more underwhelming abilities that you guys in the comments suggest below. But for now, let's get started on an ability that belongs to a Pokemon that I truly don't think will ever be viable, no matter how much we buff it: Normalize. Though, even if it was good, Delcatty is not exactly the best representative of it anyway. If Normalize was buffed though, maybe a Pokemon in the future could get it without being so terribly useless in VGC, so I do want to try and at least make it good. At the current moment, Normalize makes everything a normal type move, and it gives you a 1.2 offensive boost, which in theory is okay, especially on a pure normal type, until you realize that it also makes every move an actual normal type attack, and this comes with some very negative side effects. With Normalize, you do lose out on the chance to hit anything for super effective, but it also means you take on Normal's weaknesses, such as the ability to no longer hit ghost types and to deal resisted damage to steel and rock types. So I do want to add on the caveat that when using Normalize, all Pokemon are now going to be hit for neutral damage. So this means you no longer need to be walled out by Pokemon like Fluttermane when you're using a Normalize Fake Out, or even if you want to use a move like Normalize Ice Beam and make it into a normal type option now, you can even use this against Pokemon like King Gambit that would have once resisted both Ice Beam as a normal or ice attack, and now just hit for neutral damage instead. You could even make a case to use some status moves like, for example, Normalize Thunder Wave, which while you wouldn't be able to hit a ground type Pokemon without the ability, with this ability you can now not only hit a ground type Pokemon for paralysis, but you could even hit ghost type Pokemon, since you would no longer need to worry about normal being completely walled out by ghost types. Now, I doubt that Delcatty, even if it was in Scarlet and Violet, would make this ability look good, but I'm sure at the very least if a Pokemon like even Kangaskhan, which has some usable stats and move pool, were to get this, would at least become very viable if it did have the ability Normalize with these types of buffs. So I would like to see this ability get put onto a better Pokemon in the future, but for now, it at least would make Delcatty better than it currently is. Thankfully, until these buffs happen, Delcatty at least has 2 other kind of okay abilities, but while a few Pokemon on our list have alternative abilities, Golisopod on the other hand unfortunately does not. Emergency Exit had a cool concept of forcing Golisopod to switch, however, the condition being when you're below 50% health is a pretty huge downside. It would be a lot better if this was something that you actually had control over, so instead I'd like to make this so anytime you use a priority move, you get to switch. Now, fans of the channel probably actually remember this buff from when I made a legendary Pokemon of every single type, and I chose Golisopod as our bug type representative, but the ability buff just makes too much sense. Having the ability to use a move like Aqua Jet and quickly pivot out into another Pokemon before you're attacked, or even use a move like First Impression that only works on turn 1 to now switch into another Pokemon and get to reuse the move again with ease, these would be some pretty good ways to actually make Golisopod viable. Choice Band moveset could be very good without having to lock into these types of moves, but you could even go a step further and now use Sword Stance sets without worry of being forced out, and target moves like Leech Life and Liquidation as your powerful stabs, so you no longer need to just worry about being pivoted if you're hit by the right attack. This could honestly turn Golisopod into a legitimate trick room threat, and I would be very curious to see how it does in VGC if it had an ability like this, which frankly is just how it should have been coded from the get-go. While this isn't exactly a signature ability like our 2 previous ones, Rivalry is a really mediocre ability when you break it down. While Rivalry isn't exactly an ability you think of as being bad at first glance, having the chance to weaken your attack because the opposing Pokemon's female and yours is male is a really bad option to gamble with. And even the 1.25 times boost you can get with this ability is pretty lackluster considering a lot of modern abilities. So for our new buff to Rivalry, I'd like to give it a 1.5 times boost as long as the Pokemon that's on the opposite side of you is the same gender, and not applying any nerf whatsoever if the opponent is not the same gender as yours. I think this would make the ability actually worth using, since while this boost is a lot more powerful than most abilities would be giving options like Sword of Ruin for example, at the same time though, it's not a consistent buff, and can very easily be taken away when the right Pokemon is KO'd. So I do think there's some actual downside to it, and the upside is pretty powerful. Now I will say the current candidates for this ability aren't exactly the best in VGC, and the 2 best representatives are probably Nidoking and Nidoqueen, which would always choose to use Sheer Force anyway. So I think we're probably looking at either Haxorus or Luxray as next contenders. I could definitely see Luxray at least potentially running this in the future due to the introduction of options that can block Intimidate like Clear Amulet and Inner Focus, but even still Luxray is kind of weak, so it'd probably take a Regulation A style format for it to actually really pop off. However, in a format with that low power level, I could legitimately see a choice band Luxray just clicking Wild Charge and really not caring, especially if the right target is in the top of the metagame that has a pretty consistently locked gender. One of the newest bad abilities that came from Scarlet and Violet has gotta be the Convergent Species Toadscroll's ability that's Mycelium Mite, and it truly does just ruin this Pokemon. What could have honestly been a really powerful support user is now plagued by this terrible ability, and it truly makes it actually unusable in VGC without partnering with Weezing. Mycelium Mite makes it so any status move that Toadscroll uses always moves last in its priority bracket, which is a truly abysmal distinction to make since it's not just something you can patch up with Trick Room. However, I guess you can ignore abilities with this, so technically this is an option to support Goldengo with, as long as it's not holding Safety Goggles or Terra Grass. So I guess that's cool, but again, partnering with Weezing does the same thing but much better, because you can actually outpace Goldengo now. In order to buff this ability to make it usable, I do want to change its negative effect, so instead of last in its priority bracket, it's only half speed now. This will at least apply an upside when you use it for Trick Room, and I don't exactly think it'll be too broken anyway, because you do need Trick Room to stay up for this to work well, and on top of that, you also need to worry about Toadscroll having a speed tier that doesn't exactly work well in Trick Room. So it is a nice nerf, especially with the buff we're about to give this ability. To compensate for this though, instead of just ignoring abilities, we're gonna also make it so Mycelium Mite just ignores everything. For example, if I want to use Spore against a grass type or a Pokemon with the ability Overcoat, or even just something that has an immunity to status in general, we're gonna be able to hit it now, and it will have no worry about any accuracy or anything like that. The same goes if we want to use the move Toxic on a Pokemon that's either a poison or steel typing, or even something with like Magic Bounce or anything like that. If it wasn't something that just cured your poison to begin with, it's just gonna hit. Now, while you could technically cure this with something like a Lumberry, for example, having the ability to just circumvent any item immunity, typing immunity, or ability immunity would be a pretty cool option on Toadscroll, and I think it could make it legitimately have a niche in VGC. Even with the speed reduction being in half though, this still wouldn't exactly make Toadscroll a broken status user, since even if you were to run a minus speed Toadscroll with 0 IVs, it still reaches 49 speed when using a status move, which means that even just an Amogus running a Quiet Nature with max speed IVs would underpace you, and it could get Spores off beforehand. Now, while Amogus might not be the best option to compare Toadscroll to, since Toadscroll could status Amogus back, the fact that this speed tier is still a problem for Toadscroll when it isn't going to be using a status move is a pretty big deal. Since without using a status move, your speed with this minus speed and 0 IV would be 94, which means you are getting outran offensively by Pokemon like Iron Hands, Ursaluna, Primarina, Kingambit, and many other powerful Trick Room bets, without even getting into the very egregiously slow ones like Torkoal and Hatterene. So there would legitimately be some counterplay to Toadscroll, but it would have a much better upside now, I think, in VGC with this type of ability. Now, true and slacking is honestly the reason that half you guys probably clicked on this video, and for good measure. We're gonna make it actually good. I won't beat around the bush too much since I probably already mentioned this in the thumbnail, but we're gonna make it so slacking can now use status and offensive moves every other turn. Now, status won't face any punishment whatsoever because it is a status move after all, but for the offensive moves, we are still gonna nerf them a bit by making them deal only half damage on every other turn. This will be a big deal since while you can just lean into the stereotypical choice band Giga Impact sets to really maximize these turns where you're not getting your damage output weakened, you could also now finally change that item out for something like a Leftovers of Life Orb and maybe feature moves like Protector Body Slam as your actual moves on your moveset, since you wouldn't need to worry about just not landing an attack every other turn, and these do become a lot more valuable suddenly. Now, Power Creep has come so far since Generation 3, so while I truly doubt outside of maybe a Regulation A or Regulation H style format this even sees much play, I could at least see some eyes being on it in these lower power level formats. Since even the Pokemon with damage reducing abilities now like Palafin, which starts in a weaker form but ends up with a similar stat line, it ends up only having to switch to activate this, and frankly, that didn't even really end up being a weakness for it. It ended up just becoming a defining archetype of Regulation C. So we need to kind of catch up with the times here, and I think at the very least this version of Truant would actually be a benefit to slacking if anything. While slacking hasn't seen much success in VGC since the introduction of Weezing's new ability, at the very least, there's another infamous normal type with a very terrible ability that has finally seen the light of day because, well, it didn't need to use it. While I don't entirely mind Regigigas taking a few turns to get going, the fact that it's set to reset upon every single switch is pretty ridiculous, and a lot of modern abilities have finally changed its effect, so why hasn't Slow Start? I think the first thing that we do need to do to make this ability better is just to make it so Slow Start doesn't reset when you switch out. So if I've stayed in for 2 turns already, those 2 turns should just count towards my Slow Start timer. Not only this, but because a lot of doubles games are so short, I want to reduce the timer that this takes from 5 turns to only a measly 3 turns, which should allow Regigigas to finally actually be able to become a very strong powerhouse for your team. Finally, considering this is supposed to be a legendary Pokemon, I do want to give it a legendary benefit for having waited out these 3 turns, because let's face it, this is a pretty big drawback to be giving your Pokemon that has these kind of stats. So I want to also make it it so once you have waited these 3 turns, you now get a double stat in both your physical attack and your speed. So instead of going down to half, you just gain twice as much now. Now, while Regigigas suddenly gaining the equivalent of both a tailwind and a huge power boost in the same turn might seem a bit broken, I do need to remind you guys, Regigigas does not have a way to boost any of its offensive stats, or any stats in general really. It doesn't get moves like bulk up, sword stance, or anything of the sort, so your best means is probably trying to go with a clear amulet and spam moves like body slam to try and break through your opponent. This just means you're susceptible to things like rage powder and spore, or even the move Will-O-Wisp. So while you could maybe run items like safety goggles and lumberry to avoid these, at the same time, now you're susceptible to intimidate. Now this version of Regigigas could easily be the king of the Regis, and I would totally believe it. But we still have a couple other Pokemon that we do need to buff and make them actually viable again in VGC with their abilities. Among the fossils, Archaeops was given the short end of the stick. You'd think a Pokemon with a rock and flying typing with offensively oriented stats and a respectable 110 base speed would be very powerful, especially with a good move pool in VGC. However, with the ability to defeat us, you'd be pretty mistaken. For defeat us, we need to start by making it so this only reduces the physical attack stat, because let's be honest, Archaeops has a pretty respectable 112 special attack stat that, while it is weaker than its physical attack, could still be useful for these types of low HP situations. This would make movesets featuring options like Meteor Beam very powerful, and it could legitimately let Archaeops actually thrive in VGC as a pretty respectable setup special attacker. I do want to rework this though for anyone looking to use Archaeops as a physical attacker though, because there is still a bit more room that we can improve this by making it so the drawback only happens at 25% health instead of at 50%. This should hopefully help a lot with Archaeops, but just to add any extra good measure to this, I want to also make it so when you are in defeatist range, any physical moves can now crit twice as often, which should at least give a little bit of an upside for cutting your attack in half. And this can be pretty useful in a wide array of situations, such as Pokemon with an Iron Defense boost, or even Pokemon like Dondozo that use the ability with Commander Tatsugiri. However, I think ultimately these Meteor Beam power herb sets will still be the most viable on Archaeops, and they're gonna improve a lot with this rework of the ability. Now, there is one truly useless ability that is so bad that I doubt any of you guys remember this exists. This ability has been pretty heavily buried in the franchise, and it's only available to a single Pokemon that actually has access to a much better ability than this. And it's kind of shocking that this is actually considered a signature ability. In Generation 3, Sableye was given the horrendous ability Stall, and this ability makes it so Sableye will always move last in its priority bucket, whatever attack it's using. Now, this is essentially just a really bad version of Mycelium Might, which we've already mentioned is a pretty terrible ability. And with a name like Stall, unfortunately, there's not a lot of ways to actually take this one. So I want to try and keep the concept of moving last in its ability, but still make it actually viable. So how are we going to do that? I think the easiest way to do this is think of how we actually play Stall in competitive. By making it so any Pokemon with the ability Stall, as well as its allies, take half as much damage, this leans very much so with that stally nature of really any Stall playstyle in competitive Pokemon. And while you are still moving last in your Sableye, at the same time though, it's an incredible defensive advantage to now make sure that you and your partner both get an immediate damage reduction to both offensive stats. This is essentially just a shortcut to setting up moves like Reflect and Light Screen on your Pokemon, and it gives you more turns to activate moves like Knock Off or Fake Out on your Sableye, and you can even go for Will-O-Wisp for good measure to cripple Pokemon further once your Sableye does leave the field. Now, I don't think a Sableye is the right target for this ability by any means. At the very least, a Pokemon that has defensive stats like, let's say, Toxapex with this ability could actually be pretty useful. And in Generation 10, I would love to see Game Freak give this version of the ability to some defensive behemoth like that, because I too love seeing the world burn in front of me. Now, these were some buffs for some of the worst abilities ever in the format. And if you guys want to see me buff some other bad abilities, make sure to leave some suggestions in the comments below, as I would love to see some of your guys' ideas. While you're on the way down there, consider subscribing. I upload content like this every week, barring any sort of random IRL issues, and we have a lot of wonderful videos to provide, especially during the month of December for you guys. These videos wouldn't be possible though without my two wonderful editors, the first being Becca, who does an incredible job editing the long-form content like the video you saw today, and Dose, who also edits a ton of our long-form videos here as well. Both of their links will be down below, and I would love if you guys check them out, as well as the rest of our stuff down below. And if you want to go the extra mile to support them, you can hit the join button for just a couple dollars a month. You get some access to polls to vote on certain video topics, as well as an emotes and badges next to your name. It's a pretty cool way to show your support, and our current members are Zeke Zero, Josh Again Ultra Player, and Blood Lily. Your support is greatly appreciated, and it truly does mean the world. With that said, I'll see you guys in our next video. Until then, peace out, guys.